We have Kelsey Doncaster. Kelsey holds an MS in Resource Management from Central Washington University, a BA in History, and a BFA in Painting from the University of Washington. He's been an avid collector, lecturer, and historian of Pacific Northwest fruit box labels for over 30 years. Since he started collecting fruit box labels in 1991, he has been researching the history of the lithograph companies, growers, packers, firms, people, and places they were used on wooden boxes. And we have a box here in the flesh. So if you maybe you'll pass the box. No, just kidding. No, leave it there. So without further ado, let's turn it over to Kelsey and people.
All right. So I'm presenting today on the Big M, Montana's fruit industry, the big fruit boom and beyond. So we're discussing a topic that is actually not just unique to Montana. This also happened in Oregon and Washington, Idaho, and in California earlier. But we're going to talk about Montana and the boom in the Pacific Northwest that happened from the 1880s until 1920. And that was promoted by, of course, the railroads, the Great Northern Railway, the Northern Pacific Railway, and they were in western regions here of Montana. We have the Flathead Valley, you see on our right, and we have the Bitterroot Valley here on our left. These areas were promoted as a way for people could come out west, and they could become independent. There were slogans, independent for life. Things that you could do as a pioneer and that you could make it. And it was all about the intensely irrigated orchard plot. So you had places such as Missoula here. This is by 1909. And all these resources and are cited from my personal collection. The land of the Macintosh Red. And so they were advertising people, come to the Bitterroot Valley, come seek your fortune. You know, it's Paradise Heights. You know, it's gorgeous. It's got mountains and valleys and plenty of water, and no drought. And I know this is small, and Christine said I'm not supposed to put anything up, it's small, but I wanted to show you this is a half-page ad in Cosmopolitan magazine from 1913. It says the Bitterroot Valley offers you health, freedom, and fortune. And just like I saw in the Yakima Valley, here they're advertising $5,000 yearly for life from just 10 acres. Only 10 acres. And I like to give presentations that are interactive. Anyone want to guess? Because you, as a historian, I always want to figure what is the inflation cost? How much is that 5,000 worth today? $155,000. So back then they were saying you can make $155,000 before taxes, because there was no tax at that time, for life from just 10 acres. And they even went on to say, well, you can make, after 10 years, you can still make $155,000 at half the time. And so they lured people in, as you see here, with the gentleman stuck at his desk and in the congested city. And here, this maiden of Montana is going to come to the Bitterroot Valley, where things are pastoral and gorgeous and easy to farm. And that proved out not to be true. But it was very typical of them promoting it. The unique thing about Montana, but not totally unique, was in the Bitterroot Valley, they solicited a lot of people from colleges in the Midwest and back east, and also people from the large cities to come out, and they would have an orchard block that a manager would take over for them, and that you wouldn't have to do anything with it. They would just earn money for you while you were gone. Now, this, what I said, was not unique to the Bitterroot Valley. This also happened in the Yakima Valley. There was a St. Louis Orchards Company, which was people from St. Louis, Missouri. But like a lot of those, just as here in the Bitterroot, they eventually failed because there was too big a plot. The land wasn't good. The management wasn't what it's supposed to be. So things did not work out as advertised. But the Flathead Valley was not to be outdone by the Bitterroot Valley. So there's a little piece I got. It's this apple, big apple size, and it says, orchard homes in fertile Flathead. Why not raise apples like this yourself? So here's a 6-year-old Macintosh Red trees in the company's orchard in blossom, 200 boxes per acre. Now, an average apple tree will get 40 boxes per apple tree, one apple tree. They're saying you get 200 boxes per acre. Here's a near view of the Macintosh Red Company's orchard, October 12th, 1911. Shows apples. Some of these places I read here in Montana, they would do photo tricks. We didn't have Photoshop back in 1910. but they would take apples and they would tie them on trees and they would say, here's what you have. So that was a new one to me. Another interesting story, we'll see one last here. Here's harvest time, 500 boxes per acre. Company's orchard, 1911, and said, here's your plan. We will sell you an orchard tract 5, 10, or 20 acres in the fertile Flathead Valley. The orchard will be cared for in the most perfect and scientific manner by Senator Whiteside, the largest and most successful grower of apples in the Northwest. So they did all kinds of promotions and they lured people. I found here in the Bitterroot Valley was very interesting, but it wasn't a unique phrase. They said, if you got rocky soil, your soil had lots of rocks in it. That was good because the rocks would help keep the trees warm. And here in the Bitterroot Valley, they took it a step further because that's what they said in the Rogue River Valley of Oregon. The rocks would help keep the pear trees warm or the apple trees warm, and rocky soil was okay because it's great. In the Bitterroot, they took it a step further and they said those rocks would also help color your apples extra red. So once the apples were picked, as you see, here's a Korea postcard from the Como bench at the top up here. And they're picking the apples. And so back then, it's not like we see today. I come from apple country in Washington State. I'm a 5th generation Washingtonian. My wife's the Montanan. She's a 3rd generation Montanan. They pick things in giant bins you see today. Sometimes you'll see them at the grocery store or whatnot. But back then, they picked them in all individual apple boxes. And those boxes would actually get reused once the apples were dumped out, sorted, graded, and then packed back in the same apple box and put a label on the end. So that's what we see here in the lower left. This is about 1910 in the Bitterroot Valley. The ladies are out sorting this by hand, and they're grading the apples, put them in the box. Here's a later picture taken by Peterson of Erickson's warehouse in Corvallis. And that one is showing them sorting on a mechanical line so they can put on what apple is a good quality, a better quality, or a cold quality, and put on there. And then you can see the apple boxes coming across the front there, in front of the ladies. So as we see, here's a gal in the 1940s. She's packing an apple box full of apples with a label on there, Macintoshes, because they're advertised Macintosh red on there. These apples were put in a box, but they were identified by the color of the label. And so we see here that the labels will come in different colors. So this is the Big M brand, which advertises itself as color, flavor, quality, and value from Hamilton, Montana Fruit Distributors. And so it came in blue for extra fancy, red for fancy, and then C grade would vary. Some C grades were white and yellow and green. This one is orange. And I have some examples here. These are extras from my collection up here, these original labels. But that's how the buyer would identify what kind of fruit is this. Is it good quality fruit? Is it top grade? Is it mid grade? Is it poor grade? Interesting enough, it's also all about marketing. A friend of mine, now deceased, Dick Waxsmith from Yakima, Washington, he actually came and sold apples here in Montana, or tried to. The Bitterroot Valley people said, we won't buy your apples. This is in the 1940s. They're beautiful, they're gorgeous, but we buy our own first. So Montana first, still in the 1940s. But he would try to sell fruit in the Midwest, and they said, we only buy choice grade. And he said, well, why would you want to buy choice grade? That's C grade. That's the worst quality. Well, it's choice grade for us. They didn't know that they weren't being sold the extra fancy. They were just being sold the choice grade. Mm-hmm. So the boxes were packed and they were put in there, and then they would load 756 boxes in an individual refrigerator car. So here's a picture at the Erickson warehouse taken in the early 50s, probably, and them loading the apples on the refrigerator car there that's been iced and ready to ship to Chicago or New York or other markets, maybe even overseas. And so here's what 756 boxes looks like. Okay, so every car had 756 boxes. This is from 1908. This is from Montana Memory Project. And this shows the famous Bitterroot Valley apples grown and packed by Crescent Carey in Hamilton, Montana. And so here's the label that they use. This is from 1907. And you see this is the style of that period, which is very naturalistic. It also is kind of, not somewhat realistic, but it shows the mountains and the orchards and all kind of apples just rolling out of the basket. The interesting thing about the Crescent Carey, both of those gentlemen, they married, forgive me if I'm not right, Geyer daughters. This was the early family in the Bitterroot Valley, so they married each one of their daughters, and then they were in business together. selling apples. And from what I can tell, this firm dissolved, but then Crest continued to sell fruit up until the 30s, but not, of course, using this label. This label would have been viewed as outdated by the 1930s. So here's another one. This is D.C. Gray. Somehow both him and his son, which is named the same name, did not like whatever the name D was. I couldn't find it, but they went by Clark Gray. So Clark is the middle name. And this is about 1905. So same image we see here, you know, the mountains and the river, and then we've got the trees and a big luscious red apple. But in this early time period, you also had more primitive labels. What I mean by that is that this was a local print. This is by O.L. Kinney. This would have been done either at the newspaper in Missoula or maybe the Ravalli newspaper there in Hamilton. And so they were something that was more economical. They didn't have the big fancy artist design like the early ones we saw. This is a local print advertising Macintosh Red, the famous Bitterroot Valley, you know, planted in 1894. Other growers would go with what is called a stock label. So this is a Swanson Orchards from Corvallis. This label is very interesting because this is a stock label and this is real primitive. He didn't have it printed by a local printer. They just took stamps and they stamped it. Extra Fancy Macintosh, C.J. Swanson. I think you see up there, there's a size of how many apples were per box, 138. So they were really small. But as I mentioned, it's a stock label. So this is what it looks like without anything on it. It's blank. And so the lithograph companies did that. So then a local printer, or they would print up a label for a grower to advertise their brand. And so this brand is a beautiful label, it's pretty, but it's not unique to Montana, because here it is from the Yakima Valley. Okay. And here it is from the Wenatchee Valley. So this was one type of stock label. Another type of stock label is this one here from Dr. J.E. Porter. And Dr. Porter came to the valley in 1910 and stopped packing his own apples after 1935. But again, you know, these are stylized images. These aren't naturalistic. They're not realistic, I should say, in a sense of showing the Bitterroot Valley, because there's that same label from Papanish, Washington. So same stock design. But then they came, you had a label like this. And so this label is Bitterroot Valley, Montana apples by George F. Brooks. Real pretty image. It's 100 years ago, but still shows you sex sells. Because remember, the people buying these apples were men in big auction warehouses in New York and Boston and Chicago, and then after World War II, Los Angeles. But as I mentioned, this is actually a stock label. It's not, here it is blank. There it is from Yakima. Another one from Yakima. And there's one from Spokane. So they would try to do these to get the buyer to know, okay, I want that label. I want the label with American Indian on it. That's the one I want. But you could get in trouble if you have a stock label, because everyone else could have the same label, you know, make you set apart. So by the 1920s, we started seeing a change in the fruit industry in the Bitterroot Valley. And that was due to several issues. One, of course, was the use of the water, dealing with the big ditch, supply and availability, the problems that they had with pests. They advertised this area as pest-free, and it wasn't pest-free. There was pests that came in. Someone blamed that they were based on box shook, that's what the apple box is made out of. They call it shook. That it had the codling moth on it. That wasn't true, but people looked at other reasons and say, what was wrong? Some of the soils weren't very good in the valley. And then the big thing you had in the Northwest was the lead apple scare of 1926. Anybody heard of that? Lead apple scare of 1926. So those of us who are older will remember the LR scare of the 1980s. This was its equivalent in 1926, but that was because with the codling moth, they had to spray the apples with lead arsenate of lead. Okay, and so back then they didn't wash the apples. That wasn't something that they do now, they do today. So some of those apples, people say they would be gray. They have to wipe them down, it wouldn't be gray. And it was interesting when I did it, I taught about for my master's thesis. That spray actually was not as bad as their pints of beer that they drank in England. That's where this originated, because those pints of beer had lead in them. There was more lead in the pints of beer. But the public comment on it was very much a big scare. 80% of the market was shipped overseas at that time, went to England. And so they had to devise, what are we going to do with this? So they came up with washing machines. How are we going to wash the apples? We're going to take in and we're going to clean the apple and wash that stuff off and get it all pretty and brush it and so on and so forth. But to do that, you had to have a lot more capital. So you just didn't have little independent growers like DC Gray or Crescent Carey. You had to have bigger firms or people had to get together here. And so we had the Equity Growers and Shippers Association that started in the 1920s. And this was their brand Equity, advertising famous McIntosh apples of Bitterroot Valley. And this was started by O.M. Gerer in the 1920s, and it went out of business in 1937. You still had other people who were selling fruit, but then on a larger scale. So we have George F. Brooks here with his Bitterroot Valley Montana apples. Bitter, of course, the state flower of Montana. And George, he was an interesting fellow. He was born in the territorial capital in 1874 in Virginia City. His family left Virginia City for the green pastures of Bitterroot Valley in 1900. And by 1909, at the age of 36, he was selling orchard property there in the valley and continued to sell fruit up until the 1940s. So another firm we had, as you talk about larger firms here, is the Montana Fruit Distributors with the big M. And there's their warehouse in Hamilton, which I found out is actually still there. It's just been totally changed. Anyone's here from Hamilton can tell me, but I figured out where it is in its footprint by the aerial photos that it's still there, but it doesn't look anything like a warehouse today. So they had their 3 grades of apples, and they had E.K. Stewart as manager in the 1930s. So in 1934, Montana Fruit Distributors was one of the biggest distributors there of the fruit orchards in the valley, and they shipped apples to New York to auction market, and they got $1.75 to $2.05 a box. Again, sounds like nothing today, but back then that would be $40 to $46. So it's a good price. It wasn't, but a few years ago when I worked a while for the food industry, that you get $18 for a box of Red Delicious. So that was good money, even though it was the Depression. At the same time, they sold some of their fruit for 75 cents a box. Today's $31. For 15 refrigerator cars full of extra fancy and fancy McIntosh. That was their first sale of the season that year in 1934 in August, and that was sold to a fellow by the name of E.W.J. Hardy. And E.W.J. Hardy brings in the new era in the valley of outside buyers coming in and buying that fruit. You see here, attention, McIntosh apple growers. After growing your Macs, what concerns you most? Marketing, you should see that you place them for sale in the hands of a reliable firm and a well-known brand who can, through efficient organization, secure you for top market prices. So E.W.J. Hardy came in. He was a fruit buyer from New York City. He was involved not only here, as we see in Montana, selling Montana McIntosh, but he was also in the Yakima Valley, Washington State. He was also in the Hood River Valley of Oregon. These are the brands that he used. This is a survivor. This actually was in a fire. This is a brand that he bought. There was another firm, Maynard and Child, Maychild, that's the name. And it's either talking about export, domestic, where the fruit was going. This is an example of kind of realism label they're showing, but this is where the fruit's going to be shipped out to. Besides E.W. Hardy, there's also a fellow by the name C.H. de Montmar, and he came to the valley from New York State in 1929 and 1930. He was an interesting fellow. He caught on to the Scottish theme. His brand is Bonnie Highland apples. These came from the patent office de-accession labels in the 1980s. So there's your extra fancy, and there's their fancy grade. And then he did this for their C grade, which is interesting. It's actually a little bit fancier label with the bagpiper. De Montmar leased the McIntosh Morello property and the University Heights orchard, which those two alone would produce 75 carloads of apples at that time. So he came in not only to buy fruit, but then eventually he bought out some of the orchards and ran those for a while. It is interesting. He actually was most of the newspaper accounts we talked about in this wonderful conference about newspaper accounts and what we find things. And I found in the newspaper account that people were stealing apples from him and he had to take it to court. Because he wasn't there. Remember, he was in New York, so he had people contracted out, his representatives, to watch things. So another firm we have here, and again, this is very small. This is actually a picture taken in 1972. I found at the Ravalli County Museum and Historical Society. But Montana apples here by William Joseph Corporation, and I included a larger one here from Washington. So William Joseph Corporation came in 1931 with George F. Joseph to scout out and buy apples in the valley. Joseph was a buyer of apples not only in Montana, but also Washington. He had orchards in Washington. Anyone want to guess why this is called Don't Worry? Well, that's good. That's a good guess. Let's leave just a step back. This was, well, don't worry, the apple, see, he took a bite out of it. There's no worm coming out of the apple. And during this time, you would see some slogans, the ones that says that our apples are so good you can eat them in the dark. So the name changes here from William Joseph Corporation to William Joseph Sons. I have time here. I want to share the information because they were involved in a lawsuit. These guys, which is very interesting, they were found guilty of an Elkins Act violation in 1932, along with the Chicago Great Western Railroad, where they dominated the apple market in the Midwest with fake damage claims. So they were trying to cut a deal. So they had to reorganize as William Joseph Sons, not be William Joseph Corporation anymore. So by the 1940s, the one main packer in the Bitterroot Valley was Erickson and in Corvallis. And here we see them packing fruit in his warehouse. This is with the Cutler sizing machine. This is taken a period when they would put apples in trays. So this is after World War II, probably somewhere in 1946, 48. And we see a change in the label of something just more generic. Here's a giant red apple on a yellow background. Now, not C grade, but it was just something fairly generic, wasn't real fancy. So by 1949, there were 112,000 bushels harvested that year out of the Bitterroot Valley, which sounds like a lot, but that was down from 400,000 plus in 1919. So in 30 years, it almost dropped by 2/3. And for comparison, as we talk about regions and how that develops, Montana's competing with Oregon and Washington and Idaho for apple production besides New York State. New York State's always been the big one on the market they're trying to compete against. And in 1919, as I mentioned, 400,000 bushels of apples were picked. But in comparison, there were 5 apple growing districts in Washington State. Just the Wenatchee Okanagan district alone picked 108 million bushels of apples. And then in 1930, Washington State became #1 in apple production. So because of that, then the industry in the Bitterroot Valley started to shrink and get smaller and smaller after World War II. Infestation and bugs and disease, the poor soils, the competition eventually phased it out to where it's just a few hundred acres today. But interestingly enough, another area of the state, as we talked about originally, the Flathead Valley was also trying to catch the apple boom, and they did ship out some carloads of apples. There was some production, but there really wasn't what there is today. It was with the cherries. So while the apple boom had taken off in the Bitterroot Valley, the Flathead Valley, as I mentioned, never really took off. But then when it was fading, the Flathead Valley did take off with cherries. So here we see 2 labels of Blue Goose. And this is from Big Fork. And Blue Goose is a part of American Fruit Growers. So when I give these talks, I always talk about, well, American Fruit Growers was like the Microsoft of its day. But Microsoft isn't that big anymore. So I guess it's more like the Google or Amazon of its day. American Fruit Growers bought apples, pears, peaches, plums, radishes, rutabagas, asparagus, oranges, lemons, you name it. They were the big dog on campus that started in 1919 in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. And they were a distributor. So in 1929, the Robbins brothers, Hector and Rudolph, planted cherry trees along the shores of Flathead Lake. But this was from Woods Bay to Yellow Bay. And they were followed in 1930 by Andy Connolly, Billy Lane, Dr. J.L. Richards, A.E. Williamson, Charles Mullins, Stanley Thurston, H.A. Johnson, and E. McGrava. And by the 1930s, there were 60,000 cherry trees around Flathead Lake. Now, this can never happen in the Bitterroot Valley because the climate was not conducive to cherry production on a large scale. And as I mentioned here, so they planted the trees in 29 and 30. By 1934, they had a crop, and the American Fruit Growers marketed their crop. The interesting thing about the Flathead Valley, too, is not only did they pack the regular 15 to 20 pound box of cherries, they also packed a special 5-pound box. And that's what we see with the small little label here, a little gift pack. So things started to really grow in 1935. The Great Northern Railway builds a warehouse in Kalispell for the start of the Flathead Lake Cherry Growers Association. And this warehouse eventually is purchased by them, but the Great Northern Railway puts out enough capital to build this building. And it takes off, and then they have the big freeze in 1936. 1936 kills off most of the trees. They did have some, I found. There was a little bit of production. There were 60 or 100 trees some places, but wasn't the vast majority of the crop had to be ripped out and replanted. So during that period of time, this warehouse was not used as much as it could have been. Then by the late 30s and early 40s, they come out with a new label for their firm. It's just for the Flathead Lake Cherry Growers Incorporated. They're not dealing with the Blue Goose. They're not having to sell through them. They're actually selling their own cherries. And by 1945, there were 15 refrigerator carloads of cherries that were shipped out from Kalispell. Now, one refrigerator car, unlike apples, because the cherry box is smaller, it holds 1,218 crates of cherries. So by 1949, over 100 carloads of cherries were shipped from Kalispell. And there were 200 women who worked in the packing shed in Kalispell filling crates with cherries 24 hours a day during the height of the season. By the 1950s, most cherry orchards were established. But we still also have people selling cherries on the side. There were growers. This is the Robin family, as you mentioned, they were the starters. They grew cherries on their own. And they were part of the cooperative, or I should say the cherry growers. And then they also sold gift packs on the side, and we see here. So this is the late label from the 1940s, showing Montana sweet cherries. This is a label that they want to advertise. Now we're talking about not just Flathead Lake, we're talking about Montana. These are Montana sweet cherries. And then in the 1960s, they went back to a stock label or more simple design that was used for cherries. And so that is my presentation for you all today.